It had been raining since just before dawn, one of those spring storms that didn't roar in with lightning, but crept through the streets with a quiet, soaking persistence. The kind of rain that made everything feel slower, heavier. In the south side of Chicago, where the gutters backed up and the bus stops leaked, Elijah Carter walked with careful steps, trying to avoid puddles while keeping his nerves from showing on his face. His suit was faded navy, pressed the night before with shaking hands. The portfolio clutched under his arm was worn leather, its corners dulled by time, but inside were crisp pages, his resume letters of recommendation, market analysis charts, months of work bound together and protected like a sacred object. He passed construction workers huddled beneath a rusted awning, their paper coffee cups steaming in the cold. Some glanced up. One stared longer than the others. Elijah met his gaze for a half second before looking away. He knew what the look meant. A young black man in a suit this early in this neighborhood. They weren't thinking job interview. They were thinking court date probation, check-in. That quiet kind of judgment, the kind that wasn't said aloud but hung in the air, like humidity, had followed Elijah his entire life. He checked the time, 7:42 a.m. The interview was at 9:00 sharp downtown at Hawthorne and Stone, a firm that didn't just hire anyone. It hired the polished, the prepped, the pedigreed. Ivy League kids with surnames that opened doors before they entered a room. Elijah had none of that. No family legacy, no private tutors, just a 4.0 GPA from Chicago State and a professor who had seen something in him. Something more than a zip code. He stepped onto the train at Monroe Station, the platform already slick with mist. Commuters swarmed past him like water over stone briefcases, earbuds, eyes down, hearts closed. When the train pulled in, he squeezed in between two men in trench coats who barely noticed him. No one ever did. That was part of why today mattered. Today was his shot to be seen. By the time he got off near the loop, the sky had darkened even more. Fat raindrops splattered the pavement like warning shots. Elijah picked up his pacecoat collar, turned high, the portfolio tucked under his arm like a lifeline. The Hawthorne Tower was just a few blocks away now, gleaming through the haze like something out of another world. He could almost hear his mother's voice in his head. "Just be yourself, baby. That's enough." He pressed forward. Then he saw it. A sleek black Mercedes pulled awkwardly to the side of the street, hazard lights blinking. The rear tire sagged flat against the curb. The trunk popped open to reveal a spare tire half slid out. And beside it, hunched under a battered umbrella, was an older white man, suit-soaked tie askew, struggling with a jack that clearly wasn't cooperating. Pedestrians passed without a glance. A couple across the street sped up their steps. No one was stopping. Elijah slowed, heart pounding. He could see the lobby of the Hawthorne building just over the next block, lit warmly, glowing like a promised land. He checked the time. 8:27. He still had a chance. But he also saw the old man's trembling hands and the way the jack tilted dangerously on the wet pavement. It would take 10 minutes, maybe 15. He didn't need to help. No one would know. He should keep walking. But then his mother's voice again, firmer this time from somewhere deeper inside. "You don't help people because it's easy, Elijah. You help them because that's who you are." Without another thought, Elijah crossed the street. "Sir," he called out, raising his voice over the rain. "You need a hand with that." The man looked up startled. "I thought I had it," he muttered, exasperated. "But the damn jack, it's slipping because the asphalt's uneven," Elijah said, already setting his portfolio gently on the back seat, carefully, deliberately on the driest part he could find. Then he shrugged off his jacket and laid it down on the wet concrete, without hesitation, kneeling beside the car. The rain didn't let up. Water streamed down his back into his shoes, soaked his shirt, but his hands moved confidently. Years ago, his uncle had made him change tires on rusted pickups until he could do it in his sleep. Now that old muscle memory kicked in. As he tightened the last bolt, the old man stood beside him, still holding the useless umbrella, watching in disbelief. "What's your name, son?" the man asked. "Elijah," he said, standing, wiping his greasy hands on his already ruined slacks. He looked at the time. 8:44. No way he'd make it. Elijah Carter. Then, without waiting for a thank you, he grabbed his soaked portfolio, shouted good luck over his shoulder, and sprinted toward the Hawthorne Tower, heart pounding harder than ever, not from the run, but from the knowledge that he had just sacrificed everything for nothing more than doing what was right. Elijah's shoes slapped wet against the pavement as he ran each step, throwing up a splash of water that soaked into his slacks. The rain hadn't stopped. It only grew more insistent, like it knew how close he was, and decided to make it just a little harder. By the time he reached the front steps of the Hawthorne and Stone building, his shirt clung to his back like a second skin, and his once crisp tie hung limp and twisted around his collar. He paused for just a second outside the gleaming glass doors, chest-heaving, heart-heavy rain dripping from his forehead into his eyes. He looked down at himself, drenched, disheveled, completely out of place, but he swallowed hard and stepped inside. The contrast was jarring. Warmth, silence, the scent of polished marble, and money hit him like a wall. Inside, everything gleamed. High ceilings, white walls, abstract art. Sleek people with perfect haircuts and tailored coats moved smoothly past him, none sparing him more than a glance, though some did glance. A smirk here, a raised eyebrow there. The receptionist across the room leaned toward her colleague, whispering something behind a tight smile as her eyes flicked toward Elijah, who stood there dripping water onto the immaculate floor. He didn't flinch. He wouldn't give them that. He walked forward with quiet resolve, portfolio clutched to his chest even though it was soggy now, the edges curling under his fingers. "Hi," he said, voice steady but quiet. "I'm Elijah Carter. I had a 9-minute interview scheduled with your finance division." The receptionist's smile faded just a fraction. She checked the sleek digital clock behind her. 9:18. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," she said, polite but firm. "That would have been with Mr. Callahan. Unfortunately, he's already moved on to the next candidates." Elijah felt it hit like a punch to the ribs. He stood frozen for a second. Every nerve in his body had already burned through the storm outside, and now what little fire was left inside him flickered. He wanted to explain. He wanted to say there was an old man, his car, he was struggling, but he didn't. He just looked down at the floor for a moment, nodding slowly. "I understand," he said softly. The receptionist hesitated, maybe sensing something behind the quiet tone. "Would you like to leave your resume? I can pass it along." He nodded again and carefully pulled one from his portfolio. The paper was slightly warped, the ink near the corners smudged, but the words were legible, the effort still clear. She accepted it with a faint, sympathetic smile. "I'll make sure he sees it." Elijah met her eyes just for a second. There was something raw and tired in his expression, not anger, not even disappointment anymore. Just quiet resignation. A boy who had done the right thing and still walked away with nothing. "Thank you," he said. Then he turned and walked toward the elevators, his shoes squelching softly with each step. The mirrored doors reflected back a version of himself that looked nothing like the one he'd imagined this morning. He looked ruined. He felt it too. The elevator ride down was slow, too slow. Every second dragged. He didn't cry. He didn't clench his fists. He just stood there letting the truth settle into his bones. That maybe doing the right thing didn't always lead to reward. That maybe sometimes it just cost you everything. When he stepped back into the lobby, the rain had eased into a fine mist. Outside, the city had resumed its rhythm. People hurrying, cars honking, life moving on. Elijah paused for a moment at the glass doors, staring at the blur of traffic beyond. No one was looking at him. No one even noticed him there. And still, he didn't regret it. He walked slowly into the street, letting the last of the storm drip from his sleeves. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he could still hear his mother's voice. "You help because it's who you are." But even that felt distant now. He hadn't just lost a job opportunity, he had lost the hope that hard work and integrity were enough in a world that valued Polish over principle. Back at his apartment, Elijah set the portfolio down on the table beside the window. The fan buzzed softly in the corner, trying to dry what the storm had already claimed. He peeled off his wet jacket and hung it by the door. Its shoulders drooped as if it were tired too. The cufflinks, his grandfather's, were still in the pocket. He held them in his palm for a while, small, simple, and cold. The only thing louder than the radiator hissing in the corner was the silence of knowing he'd done everything right, and it still wasn't enough. And yet somehow he hadn't lost everything. He had kept something no resume could list, and someone somewhere might have noticed. The next morning came without warning, slipping into Elijah's apartment through the slats of the blinds like a soft reminder that life doesn't wait for heartbreak to heal. Pale sunlight cut across the peeling walls and landed on the same worn leather portfolio, resting on the table still warped from the rain. Elijah sat beside it, elbows on the table, staring at nothing in particular, just the hum of the radiator and the faint sounds of traffic several stories below. He hadn't slept much. His dress shirt still hung on the back of a chair now, stiff with dried rainwater. The cufflinks lay on the table beside his phone, untouched like two small anchors holding down whatever was left of yesterday. He had replayed the interview that never was 100 times in his head. Not out of regret, he didn't regret helping that man, but because something inside him wouldn't let it go. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just disbelief. His phone buzzed. He almost didn't look. After all, what else could go wrong? Another automated rejection, a debt reminder. But something in the way it buzzed, steady, deliberate, made him check the screen. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He hesitated, thumb hovering above the answer button. Then he took a breath and pressed it to his ear. "Hello, Mr. Carter." A woman's voice. Calm, professional, precise. "This is Natalie Quinn, executive assistant to Mr. Douglas Hawthorne. He asked me to reach out to schedule a meeting." Elijah blinked. He sat up straighter. "I'm sorry, did you say Hawthorne? As in the CEO?" "Yes, sir," she said smoothly without a trace of uncertainty. "He'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. at our executive offices. Top floor. Would that work for you?" Elijah swallowed hard, brain scrambling to make sense of what he was hearing. Yes. Yes, absolutely." "Excellent," she said. "The receptionist will be expecting you. Bring nothing but yourself." And with that, the call ended. For a long moment, Elijah didn't move. The room was quiet again, but everything felt different. He looked around as if the walls might confirm that this wasn't some hallucination born out of disappointment. Then slowly he picked up the cufflinks and turned them over in his hands. He didn't know what to think. He hadn't told anyone at the company why he was late. He hadn't made a scene or left a note. The receptionist had only seen a wet young man with ruined shoes and a tired face. And yet, they were calling him back, not for the same interview, not with HR, with the CEO himself. It made no sense, but somehow it did. By noon, he had pulled his suit from the back of the door and carefully pressed it again, trying to salvage what he could. He took his shoes to a corner shop and spent nearly an hour buffing them himself until the scuffs were merely a dull memory beneath a faint new shine. The portfolio, still damp around the edges, sat under the weight of 3 textbooks in the vain hope it would flatten out by morning. He packed everything with care, not because he thought it would impress, but because he knew what it meant to show up prepared, even when no one expected him to. That night he stood in front of the mirror, the same suit, the same man, but this time something in his eyes looked steadier. He still didn't know why he had been called, but he knew one thing for sure: he would show up. No matter what waited on the other side of those doors, he would walk through them with his head high. As he lay in bed, the city buzzing quietly beyond his window, Elijah let himself imagine for just a moment that this time being who he was might finally be enough. And somewhere across town, in a high-rise office, wrapped in glass and morning light, a worn leather portfolio sat on a CEO's desk. The cover still bore a faint stain from the street, and a single sticky note clung to its edge. "This is the kid. DH." The interview had never happened, but someone had been paying attention, and tomorrow Elijah would find out just how closely. The elevator doors glided open with a soft chime, revealing a hallway unlike any Elijah had ever walked down. The walls were lined with dark wood and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a living painting. Sunlight spilled in across polished stone floors, casting long shadows and warm reflections. Everything about this place whispered power, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that had never needed to. He stepped forward slowly, the executive access badge clipped to his lapel, feeling strangely heavy. The receptionist on this floor didn't bat an eye at his presence. No sideways glances, no whispers, just a simple "Mr. Carter. Mr. Hawthorne will be with you shortly. Would you like some water while you wait?" "Yes, thank you," Elijah replied, his voice calm despite the quiet storm just beneath his skin. He sat on a soft leather bench, crystal glass in hand, heart tapping a cautious rhythm against his ribs. It didn't feel real. Just a day ago, he'd walked out of the same building feeling like a failure, soaked to the bone and invisible. Now he was back, summoned, not scheduled, invited, not evaluated. And yet he couldn't help but wonder if this was a setup for disappointment wrapped in elegance. His fingers tightened around the glass. The double doors at the end of the hallway clicked. "Mr. Hawthorne will see you now," the assistant said with a slight nod. Elijah stood. His legs felt steady, even if the rest of him wasn't. As he approached the office, he caught a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror, shirt pressed, tie straight, eyes clear. He didn't recognize the man staring back completely, but maybe that was the point. The office was vast but understated. No gold accents, no oversized desk. Just clean lines, dark furniture, and a wall of windows looking out over the skyline. A single chair faced those windows, and in it sat the man Elijah had last seen, standing beside a broken-down Mercedes umbrella, shaking in one hand, tire iron in the other. Douglas Hawthorne turned his chair slowly, and for a brief moment Elijah saw the exact same face he'd helped on the street, but framed now by authority, not vulnerability. Mr. Carter Hawthorne said simply, standing and extending his hand. "Good to see you again." Elijah took it firm and steady. "I didn't realize. Yesterday I had no idea who you were." "That's exactly why it mattered." The CEO set his tone even. He gestured to a pair of chairs near a small round table far from the desk. "Please, sit." Elijah obeyed, lowering himself onto the leather seat, clutching the portfolio in his lap like a shield. But Hawthorne made no move toward formality. He didn't open a laptop or flip through papers. He simply folded his hands in his lap and looked at Elijah, the way someone might look at a painting they hadn't quite figured out yet. "I saw your resume," he said after a long pause, "and I read your cover letter. It was honest, direct. A little rough, but it showed thought. Your market analysis on Southeast Asia, solid. You've got the technical skills." Elijah nodded once, unsure if he should thank him or wait for the but Hawthorne continued, "That's not why you're here." A silence settled in. Elijah held it, waiting. "You didn't tell the receptionist why you were late. You didn't ask for another chance. You just left your resume and walked out." Quietly. He glanced toward the corner of the room, where Elijah's portfolio, still a little warped, sat neatly on a side table. "I remembered it," Hawthorne said, "because I saw you place it on the seat of my car, dry side up, before kneeling down to help me in the pouring rain. That told me everything I needed to know." Elijah opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. There were no words for the swirl of surprised confusion and something dangerously close to hope blooming in his chest. "I don't know who taught you to move through the world like that," Hawthorne said, "but I respect it." Elijah looked up, eyes meeting the CEO's. "My mother," he said quietly. "She taught me to help people even when no one's watching." Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Then she raised you well." For the first time since stepping off the elevator, Elijah allowed himself to exhale, not in relief, in recognition that something real was unfolding here, not just a second chance, but a different kind of test. And somehow, without ever stepping into the original interview, he had already passed it. Elijah sat a little straighter now, though he still held the portfolio like it might slip from his lap if he let go. There was something about the way Douglas Hawthorne spoke, measured, quiet, but firm, that made it impossible to relax completely. And yet the room didn't feel threatening. It felt intentional, like every second here mattered. "You're probably wondering why I asked you here," Hawthorne said, standing and walking slowly toward the window. His voice softened, not in volume but in tone. "I've been hiring people for a long time. Analysts, consultants, interns, executives. I've seen more resumes than I can count. I can tell within 30 seconds who's read the textbook, who's memorized the jargon, and who actually understands how to think." He turned, hands tucked into his pockets. "But here's the thing," he continued. "I can teach someone how to read a balance sheet. I can train them to model markets, pitch strategies, follow procedures. What I can't teach, what no school, no internship, no algorithm can replicate, is character." Elijah blinked. He hadn't expected that word. Hawthorne took a step closer, nodding toward the portfolio. "You left that behind, not carelessly, not because you didn't value it, but because you were in a rush to help. You didn't know who I was. You didn't think it mattered. but you still set that folder down carefully in the driest spot you could find, like it held something sacred. Then you laid your own jacket on the pavement and knelt down in the rain. The silence stretched again, but not awkwardly. Elijah could feel the weight of it, not as pressure, but as acknowledgement. Hawthorne wasn't testing him. He was honoring something that had already been proven. "I'm not offering you the analyst position you applied for," Hawthorne said. The words dropped like a stone. Elijah's heart lurched. But before the spiral could begin, Hawthorne held up a hand, a small smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "I'm offering you something else. Something better." Elijah stared. "You'll work directly with me," the CEO continued. "Special assistant. No cubicle. No layers of hierarchy. You'll be in the room during real decisions, listening, learning, absorbing. You'll see how the business actually runs, not just from spreadsheets, but from behind the eyes of the people who build it." He let that settle before finishing. "It won't be easy, and it definitely won't be comfortable. But if you're willing to do the work, I'll make sure what you walk away with is worth more than any entry-level job ever could offer." Elijah didn't speak at first. He couldn't. His throat tightened as 1,000 thoughts collided at once. Disbelief, gratitude, fear, the echo of all the closed doors he'd faced before this moment. Somewhere in the mix was that little boy from Southside Chicago who used to pretend he worked in a corner office while cleaning up his uncle's garage. That boy was wide-eyed now, staring out through Elijah's eyes at the man who had just cracked the door to a future he'd barely dared to imagine. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice low, raw. Hawthorne looked at him for a long moment. "Because someone once believed in me before I earned it," he said, "and it changed everything." He reached out his hand again, not as a formality, but as a gesture of trust. Elijah looked down at it, then up again. This time when he took it, he didn't feel like the soaked young man begging for a chance. He felt like someone who had already proved himself, just not in the way the world expected. And for the first time in a long, long time, that was enough. Elijah followed Hawthorne out of the office with the offer still ringing in his ears, echoing louder than the soft clicks of their footsteps on the polished floor. He clutched the portfolio, not because he needed it anymore, but because it had been there with him through everything. The rain, the rejection, the waiting, and now, this. They paused at the edge of the executive floor, where the entire city stretched out behind glass. The view was breathtaking. Chicago laid bare in the morning light, a living, breathing thing beneath them. Hawthorne turned his hands still tucked into his pockets, calm as ever. "I brought you up here," he said, "not just to offer you something, but to make sure you understood where you were stepping into." Elijah nodded. He didn't trust his voice yet. "This place," Hawthorne continued, "isn't just about strategy decks and market forecasts. It's about people, about judgment, about being the person in the room who speaks up when no one else will." He turned back toward the window. "A lot of young men walk through these doors trying to prove they belong. You don't need to do that. You already did on a street corner under a rainstorm when no one was watching." Elijah stood beside him, now quiet. The hum of the city far below almost sounded like applause, like the world might finally be clapping for the right reasons. He thought of his mother again, of her voice in the kitchen humming while stirring beans, telling him stories about dignity that had nothing to do with money. He thought of his grandfather's cufflinks in his pocket and the job interviews he used to rehearse in the mirror, trying to sound like someone who didn't come from where he came from. Now here he was, being told not to act like someone else, but to keep being exactly who he was. "Do you want this?" Elijah Hawthorne asked, not unkindly. "Because this isn't charity. It's not a second chance. It's a calling, one you've already answered once." Elijah breathed in deeply. The air smelled different up here, like possibility. "I do," he said quietly. "I want it." Hawthorne nodded once satisfied. "Then you start Monday. Don't worry about what to wear. Just show up on time, be present, and be ready to learn. The rest will come." As they made their way back to the elevator, Natalie, the assistant, stepped forward and handed Elijah a slim envelope. "Access badge," she said with a small smile, "and a welcome packet." Elijah took it carefully as if it might vanish if he blinked. The gold foil lettering on the envelope shimmered under the fluorescent light. His name was printed cleanly across the front. When the elevator doors closed behind him, Elijah looked down at the reflection in the mirrored panel. Same suit, same shoes still holding a faint stain from the storm. But something was different now. He stood taller, not because someone had finally opened a door, but because he'd walked through it on his own terms. Down in the lobby, the security guard from the day before barely glanced up this time. He just nodded and handed Elijah his visitor log to sign, as if Elijah belonged there all along. Outside, the last of the rain had dried, leaving the pavement warm and streaked with sunlight. Elijah stepped out onto the sidewalk and turned his face toward the sky. He didn't smile. Not yet, but his eyes softened just a little. Because sometimes the world gives you a break. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the world sees you the same moment you finally start seeing yourself. That afternoon, Elijah returned to his apartment in a kind of stillness he hadn't known before. It wasn't the quiet of disappointment or exhaustion or defeat. It was the quiet that follows a storm when the wind stops and everything holds its breath. He locked the door behind him and stood in the small entryway for a moment, just looking around. Same cracked ceiling, same scratched floor, same humming radiator. And yet everything felt different. He took off his suit jacket and hung it on the same nail by the door, but this time it didn't sag with defeat. It stood like a badge of honor, a weathered reminder of the boy who'd walked into the rain and come out the other side seen. The portfolio still sat in his hand, its leather now dry but forever warped. Elijah laid it down gently on the kitchen table, where it had waited for him so many nights, while he printed draft after draft of cover letters. For a long moment he simply looked at it. He didn't need it anymore, but he would never throw it away. He pulled out the chair and sat elbows on the table, letting the weight of the day settle around him. Not heavy, but full of meaning, full of the echoes of what Hawthorne had said. You don't need to prove you belong. You already did. Elijah's phone buzzed, a video call from his mother. He hesitated for just a second before answering. Her face filled the screen, smiling worn beautiful in that way only truth can be. "Baby," she said, her voice immediately warm. "You look tired. How'd it go?" He opened his mouth to explain and found that his throat caught before the words could form. But then he laughed softly, rubbing his hands over his face. "Mama," he said finally, "it didn't go how I thought it would." She tilted her head, concerned. "What do you mean it went better?" And just like that, her whole face lit up. She didn't need the details. Not yet. She just knew. She clasped her hands in front of her chest. "I told you, Elijah. I told you when you stay true to who you are, this world can't ignore you forever." He smiled small and quiet. "You were right." After the call, he stayed at the table a while longer, the sunlight sliding across the room in slow golden ribbons. The city outside moved as always, sirens in the distance, footsteps in the hall, voices carried through thin walls. But inside it felt like something had shifted, like time had stopped just long enough to mark this day as different. Elijah stood and walked to the window. Below, cars rushed past like nothing had changed, and maybe for them nothing had. But for him, everything had. He wasn't just a name on a resume anymore. He wasn't a soaked suit or a missed interview. He was the man who had stopped, the one who helped, the one who stayed kind when no one was looking. That was the real interview, and he had passed it long before anyone ever said his name out loud. He closed his eyes for a second, breathing it in, not the air, the moment. Then he turned from the window, picked up the cufflinks from the table, and slid them into his shirt sleeves with care. Monday would come soon, and he'd be ready. If this story reminded you that quiet choices still matter, and that integrity is never wasted, go ahead and like the video, share it, or leave a comment below. We share stories like this to honor the moments that change lives, even when no one is watching. Thanks for being here with us today.